morning, Warsaw. Today is Friday, 8th September. It will be mostly cloudy with highs of 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:14 a.m. and sunset at 7:24 p.m. We are on the 39th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and the British King George IV gets involved after a letter from the Polish president in exile. But is it a good result?
Philippe, I'm not going to reveal everything right now at the beginning. Obviously, Roger will tell us more about it towards the end of the episode. But let's start with Claire. Claire, what have you got for us today?
Yesterday, the Germans proposed that the Polish insurgents capitulated, and on the 8th, there is the negotiated ceasefire. So this is the time for the civilians to be evacuated from the city. There's a group of about 6,000 people, most of them women and children, of course, because the men are still fighting, and they leave between midday for a couple of hours till about 2 o'clock. I've got to say it's a wretched, miserable column of these people moving out, accompanied by mixed feelings on both sides, really. The insurgents who are remaining to fight are watching as the civilians move out. And at this point, I think, there's a sense of betrayal on both sides. Even though there's been a ceasefire, the civilians are cursing the soldiers who've brought them to this point. The soldiers are cursing the civilians who are moving out to become prisoners of the Germans. So at 2 o'clock, the period of ceasefire is over, and immediately the Germans launch a strong attack from the south, from still central Warsaw, but from south of the Old Town area, from the direction of Nowy Swiat Street that we mentioned earlier. As a result, the Home Army are forced to retreat again. They now have to withdraw from several buildings that they'd captured earlier in late August. So that includes the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Holy Cross Church, and the Blue Police headquarters. And as they pull out, the whole sort of previously relatively quiet southern area in the centre of Warsaw is shelled with terrible accuracy. The Germans are shelling them exactly every 8 minutes, and they are using their highest caliber guns. And this really feels like the end of days. Hundreds of missiles fall in that area of the capital, and several of the streets are completely reduced to rubble. So the ever decreasing area that the Poles are holding, it's just, even that is now starting to be destroyed. Normally it's me that tells the individual stories, the personal stories on the ground. But I think, Alina, you've got a connection to this one, a story of a Yugoslavian doctor.
Yes, Claire, there's information about a Yugoslav doctor who was living in Warsaw before the war, and his name was Dr. Bach. He also, during the uprising, provided medical assistance, mainly to civilians, and sometimes to insurgents at his apartment on Ulica Wilanowska, which is in the southern part of Warsaw. But there's also unconfirmed information about another Yugoslav fighter, Jedzimir Dagnic, who was a Bosnian Serb, and I know he's a little bit controversial. I don't really want to go into his story, but there are unconfirmed rumours that, he took part in the capture of the Pasta building, for example, and all of these sorts of very world-renowned actions that the insurgents took part to in the Warsaw Uprising. So, there's no really confirmed evidence that he did what he did in the Warsaw Uprising. There's just, information that's just been repeated over and over again. But what we do know is that he was executed by the Soviets in 1947 in Sarajevo. So, I don't want to get involved in the political side of all of this, but he did probably most likely take part in the uprising. What he did, we don't really know 100%. But before I move on, I just wanted to also talk about some other resistance fighters, because we have been touching on this. We've touched on the Hungarians, we've touched on John Ward, we've touched on Eileen Short. There were so many different nationalities that took part in the uprising. It wasn't just the Poles. We have Polish Jews, we had Hungarian Jews. There's a lot of people. And the other group of people we haven't talked about are the Czechs. So there is a man from Ostrava, Albin Huska. He was from the Moravian side of Ostrava. He was incorporated into the Wehrmacht. And when he came to Warsaw, he made contact with the insurgents, where he was able to deliver medication and food and supplies that the insurgents needed. And then he deserted from the Wehrmacht, and he took part in the uprising for about 17 days. He was wounded twice, And he survived. He headed back to the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, which was what it was known at the time. And after the war, he was awarded a Golden Cross of Merit. So a Czech forced into the German army, who then fought in the Warsaw Uprising and deserted and survived. You know, we've got quite a lot of these kind of really interesting stories. We have another gentleman from Prague called Karel Vakula or Vatula. I'm not sure whichever way the Czech pronounce it. Apologies, it's the Polish pronunciation here. Please don't judge me, any Czechs that are listening to this. So he fought in the Campinos Forest, so in the northwestern part of Warsaw, and he dies on the 29th of September during the Battle of Jaktorów, and we will come to the Battle of Jaktorów. I will be talking about it on September the 29th, so we will come back to that. But we don't really know much more about him because he does die during the Warsaw Uprising. We have another insurgent, Frederick Druckzner, who was born in Vienna, and he fought in the Warsaw Uprising with the insurgents, and he also dies. This gentleman dies on the 30th September, so also somebody we don't know enough information about because he died during the Warsaw Uprising. And of course, there were various nurses that came from the Moravian Ostrava district, and they worked in some of the hospitals alongside the Polish nurses, Polish Red Cross, and whatnot. So let's continue this theme of foreign influence. So instead of foreign fighters, we can move over to the foreign influence politically. And Roger, I think this is what Philippe was alluding to at the beginning of the programme. So let's talk about what's happening in London.
Yeah, London again is sort of scene of a lot of these diplomatic wrestles going on with Poland and Warsaw, particularly, very much at their heart. There was actually a royal intervention on the 8th of September. King George VI responded to a letter from the President of the Republic, so the President of the Polish government in exile, Władysław Raczkiewicz. And he said, again, I think expressed very eloquently his sympathies. So he said, every way was tried not to miss the opportunity to ease the pain experienced by soldiers and civilian population of the Polish capital. But assistance on the scale that we would like to extend to our faithful and loyal allies was impossible. So again, that sounds almost terminal. Despite this, he says, my government is still trying all possible ways to improve this situation, and please believe me that I will observe these efforts with the greatest personal interest and sympathy. Again, it kind of, to me, it harks back almost to the sort of messages that the Poles received in 1939 as well, where they were, lots of expressions of sympathy and fight on and very gallant and you're doing the right thing, but really in truth not much more than sympathy being the word, not much more than that, unfortunately. So, but it's interesting that the king obviously felt moved to respond in that way. At the same time, there is an article in the Tribune, again left-wing newspaper out of London, on the 8th of September, which again sort of gives a curious insight into British left-wing thought regarding Warsaw. So it makes a couple of points that are significant. The first one is it says that, it sort of commends the rising. It says that the rising was, it wasn't wrong-headed to have started. It's been sufficiently strong to have held out, without outside assistance for what was now, nearly 6 weeks. So it commends the rising on that basis. It explains that the effort to assist the rising by the Western powers, although insufficient, is nonetheless, a noble undertaking, and it references, by comparison, the Anglo-American efforts to supply the Soviets in the early phase of the war via the Atlantic convoys, the Arctic convoys as well, with Lend-Lease supplies up to Murmansk and elsewhere. And it makes the point, it says, we do not remember any criticism of the early convoys to Russia that paid such a heavy toll in ships and men and equipment. Nobody said that they were not worth the loss because only a fraction of the equipment got through. So they're making the point that, this is still a valid undertaking and still a noble undertaking, even if only a tiny proportion of that material that's sent actually arrives. But then on the other hand, in spite of that, those are two positions that you can adhere to and agree with. The other point that it makes is one that difficult in retrospect to justify. The other point it makes is that it says that the accusation that the Russians are deliberately holding back their armies on the Vistula is unjustified. And that betrays two things. It betrays that sort of left-wing willingness to sort of, allow the Soviets the benefit of the doubt, because they're, fundamentally there's a sort of ideological alignment there. So they're unwilling to criticize the Soviets too strongly. So they say that Stalin is not holding his armies back when, we can be pretty sure that he was, and with the benefit of hindsight.
So, Roger, you've been following von Dem Bach's diary, and I think there is quite an important entry he makes today, which is worth mentioning before we close.
Yeah, it's actually unusual. It's a transcript of a telephone conversation on the 8th of September from von Dem Bach. But I think it's quite instructive. He says, today's fighting gives a clear picture. There is no point in counting on a sudden and unexpected capitulation. Now, you bear in mind that in the days running up to this, they had, as we've described, they had overrun the old town. And in many cases, they had taken in large numbers of civilians, whether willingly or not, and whether well treated or not, in most cases not. But nonetheless, the offer of some sort of amnesty in that sense, some sort of ceasefire and so on, had actually proved quite productive from a German perspective. Whereas in the early days of August, they'd been going in all guns blazing, literally and metaphorically, with all of these massacres that we talked about in places like Wola and Ochota and elsewhere. Now the method has sort of shifted. So there was no quarter given to civilians at the beginning of the Warsaw Rising. Now the procedure has shifted somewhat. Policy has shifted, where they've got this transit camp at Prushkov set up. They've got this pathway that sends those civilians that surrender or that fall into their hands are passed on into the concentration camp system of the Reich. So that actually is, for many civilians, of course, is kind of more appealing than being shot. I mean, it seems an obvious thing to say, but this actually works relatively well for the Germans. And I think this shows you that that sort of more moderate policy, if such a thing is possible to describe, is actually bringing some dividends. But so he says in this conversation, he says, yesterday and today, a total of 30,000 people left. But so that shows you that from their perspective, this sort of gradual removal of the civilians from the battleground is proving quite effective. But he says the real AK, the underground, remains hard. Right, so they're still fighting. So he's saying that yes, the policy is working. We're removing civilians from the battlefield, but any idea that this is going to lead to a sort of sudden capitulation of Polish forces is wrong-headed, because the AK is still fighting on. It's fighting very hard. So it's a really quite instructive little exchange.
Thank you so much for joining us for day 39 of the Warsaw Uprising. It's a bit of a short one for you guys today, but we will come back tomorrow with a slightly longer episode. So thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow for day 40.